Hi and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Basics, which are episode 26 of season 2 and episode 1 of season 3 of Star Trek Voyager. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Voyager of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest poll, just barely by a wide margin. This was actually a very close poll, but the episode to win is Basics. So Basics is the two-part episode that begins with Voyager receiving a message from Seska claiming that she has given birth to Chakotay's son, whom she implanted with DNA, and that they're in trouble because Kala found out that the son wasn't his. So Voyager goes on a mission to rescue Chakotay's son, but then they find out it was all a trap and Seska was lying, and it was just a trap to get Voyager into Kazon space so they could take it over. And the Kazon take over Voyager and imprison the crew and then abandon the crew on a primitive world. As the crew tries to survive on the primitive world, the Doctor is on board with Ensign Suder trying to sabotage this ship, while Tom Paris escaped on the shuttle and is rallying the Talaxians to rescue them, which they eventually do, but Suder must give his life to do so. After on the planet, a few people die, but they make friends with the natives. Voyager returns, and they're all rescued. And in the process, Seska is killed, and the Kazon flee. So, this, I think, is a very interesting episode, because if you watch any of my videos before, you know my opinion on Voyager, which actually, I will admit, varies from a lot of other opinions I've seen. But my opinion is that the first two seasons were great, and season 3 was awful. And then season 4 was awesome, probably the best, and then the show went slowly downhill after that, but that's beside the point. The point is that, to me, this is a very interesting two-parter to look at, because the first part aired in what I think is one of the best seasons, season 2, and the second part aired, and to me, which is clearly the worst season of the show, season 3, and you can really tell. And I have talked about this in other videos. It was interesting looking at the microcosm in this particular episode. Because the thing is that Voyager, season 3 of Voyager, decided to go in a totally different direction. Michael Piller, who was the showrunner for Next Generation, head writer for Next Generation, started out the first couple seasons of Deep Space Nine and then went on to Voyager, left at the end of Basics Part 1, which he was heavily involved in creating. And in fact, this is reminiscent of the Best of Both Worlds, the classic Next Generation episode everyone knows and loves, where Picard is turned into Misuse of Borg, because in that two-parter, which ended season 3 of Next Generation, Michael Piller was considering leaving the show, in which case he wasn't really concerned about how they were going to resolve part 2, because he was just going to leave the show and be like, so long, suckers, and leave someone else to finish this impossible, paint themselves out of this impossible situation. But it turned out he did end up coming back to Next Generation, thank God, and so he was left with trying to figure out how to resolve Best of Both Worlds. But with Basics, he actually did pull that so long suckers routine, because he painted them into this impossible corner where the entire crew of Voyager was stranded on a primitive world with pretty much no recourse, and he left and said, okay, you guys figure it out. Now, they did leave some really obvious avenues to which to resolve this situation, such as Tom Paris obviously going away in the shuttle and going for help with the Talaxians, and then Ensign Suder still being alive and on board, and the Doctor still being on board. And so it wasn't that difficult of a situation. And plus, they set up some really obvious conundrums for the crew to face on the planet, where you see primitive people in the background, and you see this monster serpent looking thing, and then you see volcano activity. And so part 2 to me is just really telegraphed. It just takes all the setup that was there and just does the obvious thing with it. So it really has no creativity. But again, this gets into what I think of season 3, because I think season 3, and I talked about this in my review of season 3, but season 3 was incredibly rushed because they had a different plan for season 3 to begin with, like leading right up into this episode. They were going to continue the story arc with Seska and the Kazon after this episode, and they were going to make a long-term story arc out of the fact that Chakotay had a son. But when that was the plan until they started working on this episode. In fact, changes were made to this episode at the very late stage. For example, Seska was killed. The decision to kill off Seska was made on set as they were filming it. And the actress found out 10 minutes before she went to film her scene. And she was obviously not happy about this. And I can understand, because she's a great actress and she was a great character. Arguably, and I don't know anyone who would argue against this, the best villain of the entire show of Star Trek Voyager ever had, and yet they just killed her off 10 minutes before they were going to shoot it. So it was obvious that season 3 they were sort of retconning all the plans that were set up from season 2, and so I think that's a huge factor in why the rest of season 3 is no good, because they were really making it working on the cuff. In fact, later season 3 gets a bit better, because that's when they had a bit more time to plan and figure out what they're actually going to do. But the majority of season 3, especially the first half, was a mess, because they totally changed direction at the last minute and decided to write the Kazon off of the show. Now, first thing I want to get to is Chakotay's son, because that's the thing that irritates me the most about this episode. I think this is kind of probably the worst retcon in Star Trek history, because it's obvious, even before I knew any of this behind the scenes moment, it was obvious from the second part that this was a horrible retcon, because the first part really sets up, it has this amazing scene with Chakotay having a vision quest and talking to his dead father, and his dead father tells him about how, even though the son was born without his consent, that it's still his son and he still needs to care for it. And it was very touching, very moving, and it got Chakotay motivated to go, all right, let's go find my son. And it was obviously written as the beginning of a really long story arc, which I think would have been amazing, with Chakotay trying to reconcile with his son that was born against his consent. But it's part 2 comes along, and we get the scene in the sickbay where Seska is, holding, the baby, and doctor comes in, and she mentions something like, "Oh, Chakotay's going to be very happy to pleased that his son's okay," and the doctor just casually says, "Oh, that's not his son." And she's like, "What?" And he's like, "Oh, it's actually Maj Kuller's son." But it's like, look at him. He looks like Cardassian and human. He's like, "Oh, the Kazon, sometimes Kazon features or are dismissive or misgenerations or are not that obvious." Whatever. Bullshit! This was the biggest piece of bullshit retconning in the entire Star Trek franchise, in my opinion. It was such a clunky way. There are many things that this episode retconned, but some of them, which I'll get to later, were actually done in a very good way, a smooth way, which you can tell. This was a horrible, clunky, so ridiculously bad way to retcon. "Oh, that's not Chakotay's son," and it strikes in the fact of all of continuity that was established. It's so obvious. Even if you can say logically, well, you can explain it away logically, it's still beyond obvious that that was not their plan originally, because it was done so clunkily. Now, with so the decision was made to write the Kazon off the show, because they weren't a very popular villain. And in fact, I agree with that. In fact, I know a few people who would defend the Kazon. Most people agree that the Kazon was a poor choice for main villain. In fact, a lot of people like to dismiss the first 2 seasons because of the Kazon, which I personally disagree with. First of all, season 1, the Kazon hardly appear, and when they do, it's actually good. In season 2, yeah, they kind of suck, but most of the time they were used in interesting stories, even though the Kazon themselves are not interesting and just come off as Klingon ripoffs. The stories around them were actually used for a good purpose, and Basics Part 1 is a great example of that, of how you had this really intense story of Voyager being outsmarted by Seska, who's a tactician, and this involved the Kazon, and even though the Kazon suck, the episode itself was still fascinating and intense. And you had that duality of the fact that the Kazon suck and were unliked, but that Seska was really well liked and looked on as the best villain. So I think the obvious solution to this would be to write the Kazon off the show, but keep Seska on the show. And how do you do that? Well, you have Seska survive and have her taken prisoner. Have her be injured like she was at the end of the episode, but instead of die, they take her and put her in the brig, and so she will take Suder's place as the person who's like trapped this prisoner who they don't know what to do with. And then maybe eventually she can, because she's so crafty and deceptive, that she'll try to try to convince Voyager that she can be useful to the crew, and then something happens some later episode in the season where she does actually save the ship, so she gains some favor, so she manages to get some limited access to the ship, but then and so you have this like anti-hero, this uneasy ally, and that would be such a great storyline. In fact, I kind of get the feeling that was their original intention, since originally they weren't going to kill off Seska, but for some reason, 10 minutes before shooting, they decided to kill her off instead, which I think was a gigantic mistake. Now, as far as Chakotay's son goes, I do understand why they didn't continue with this planned storyline, because that would involve the Kazon and would seem really repetitive. In fact, I do think, even as much as I love season 2, I do see how that storyline was wearing a bit thin, and I think the decision to end that storyline with Basics was a good decision. But they should have kept Chakotay's son, and having that bullshit retcon, oh, this isn't your son, it would have been so much more interesting if they kept Chakotay's son and he stayed on Voyager with them, and that could be another dynamic between him and Seska, and have Chakotay raise his son, have him be a father. That would be a very interesting character arc, but instead in later seasons, as we see, they kind of abandoned Chakotay and treated him like a nonsensical background character, which is bullshit. So a lot of my problems with Voyager is it all begins here in this episode, Basics Part 2. It all begins in Season 3. Season 4 is great, mind you, because they sort of have a way to sort of have this amazing season. But then after that, it slowly goes downhill. But it's following the trend that's set here of not having continuity. Because the first 2 seasons, and some people bash Season 2 for each episode being individual, not having that much continuity, which I cannot disagree with more personally. But even if you feel that way, like Season 1 and 2 had set up a community. It's like this Voyager was a ship alone in the Delta Quadrant in their own community, and you have the recurring characters like Hogan and Carrie in Season 1 who just disappeared. I'm talking about him. So you have this a set of characters in Suder, and Suder was another one who was meant to go on to be have a long-term arc in Season 3 that they just killed off in this episode. And speaking of Hogan, killed him off too. So this is what I think The problem with the later seasons of Voyager is that they became too episodic. They lost that sense of community. They lost that sense of continuity that season 2, even though season 2 was very episodic, it still had the same base characters. It still had some recurring storylines like Seska and Michael Jonas, and it had this sense of continuity. It could have been better, don't get me wrong, and I do nitpick seasons 1 and 2 for running away from continuity more than they should have, but I think it got a lot worse in the later seasons, and that all began here, because here they're cutting off all sense that makes this continuity. They killed off Suder, they killed off Hogan, they killed off Seska, they got rid of the Kazon, which again I don't mind them doing that, but it's just a part of the bigger issue. And of course getting rid of Chakotay's son. They're like, this is not your son. Oh, god damn it. So this is why I think this is the episode where Voyager went bad, even though season 4 is an exception to this because it was amazing. But this is when the Voyager started running away from continuity. They said, fuck continuity, fuck this sense of community that we're building in the first 2 seasons. And season 3 just followed with a bunch of episodic episodes that completely rewrote, and in some cases, like Kes, destroyed the characters that were established in the first 2 seasons. So yeah, so I see Basics Part 2, even though it was a decent episode, I don't hate Basics Part 2. I'm more upset of the long-term implications of season 3. But Basics Part 2, it didn't completely ruin the setup in Part 1, but it was predictable. It was just like, as I said before, it was the natural conclusion to all the setups, so it wasn't very original. Yeah. But the exception to that is Ensign Suder. His storyline was the one thing that was the really good thing about Part 2, that saved Part 2. And this is the thing I was referring to earlier, where they retconned something but did it in an amazing way rather than the shitty way that they did the Chakotay Sun thing, because with Suder, he actually wasn't meant to die in this episode. He was supposed to have a long-term story arc in season 3, and I wish they would have done that, because this was a great character, played by a really great actor, Brad Dourif. But if they were going to kill him off, this was the best way to do it. They did it in an amazing way by having this really powerful story arc where he's with the doctor and he doesn't want to kill because he's this reformed person and he thinks killing is his dark side, and the doctor's having to convince him you have to do it for the greater good, and to see the toll that this takes on him every time he takes a life and how it destroys him to do it, and at the end of the episode he has to go in mow down and kill a whole bunch of Kazon, and how awful he feels at doing that, and because he was so distracted by how awful he was feeling, he got killed himself. Very tragic story, and it was almost tear-jerking the way that they do honor him at the way and say we would have been able to save Voyager if it wasn't for him. So that was the saving grace of this episode, really, and it really was a great way. If you're going to retcon something, that's the way you do it. Not this isn't anyway. I talked about that enough. Anyway, the thing that's getting back to Part 1, the thing that's kind of frustrating to me in that episode is whenever you have an episode that it's obvious they're walking into a trap. And you just see it happen. Everything goes on. They come up with these holographic, ships or whatever to try to distract the Kazon. But it's obvious that they're going to fail. So it's kind of frustrating to watch to watch your heroes fail, and they know they're going to fail, and you know they're going to be outsmarted. But that being said, it was still a good episode. It was still kind of intense. It's just I found that part of it frustrating. But it was even worse if you watched this while it aired, which I did. The commercials for this episode give away the ending. which is ridiculous. They reveal, oh, Voyager crew stranded on the planet. That happens in literally the last scene of the episode. The entire episode is about them like trying to fight through this maze of Kazon and get to Chakotay's son. That was a surprise. That was a surprise ending that the freaking advertising ruined. I can't believe that. And them being stranded is more about part 2. But anyway, yeah. So, I did like some things on the planet in part 2, and even though it was kind of predictable, there would be this monster they had to face, and there would be these primitive people who try to kidnap them, and there'd be volcanoes. The volcanoes seem really unnecessary. It's like, really, the monster and the people, the cavemen weren't enough. You have to throw a volcano in there as well. But what I did like is, this is a good use of Chakotay. This is something that later seasons would forget about. They couldn't use him properly. But here, because they were in this survival situation, and it showed that Chakotay was at his top, that he knew, because he was sort of raised to live in the wilderness like this, and he had a lot of his skills. And I like how they even sort of make fun of it, he's not, is because he's Native American, but he's not the typical Native American, because when Tuvok makes a bow and arrow, he's like, oh yeah, Tuvok, my tribe never used arrows, I never used out-of-line arrow, and you're being stereotypical with the Indian thing. And Tuvok's like, no, actually this is for me, I studied archery. He's like, oh, okay. That was funny. I did like that. So I did like it wasn't stereotyping Chakotay too much as a Native American, but it was highlighting some of the aspects of his upbringing and how this was very useful, how he knew what kind of food, and he was what was great, the best use of Chakotay was the way he was communicating with the other primitive people, how he would be like, listen to the sound of my voice. He'd talk, he'd be calm, even though he knew that they couldn't understand a word he was saying, that they could understand the tone and the gestures. And it was great until Neelix started going, Rah! Yelling at them, and then they started freaking out. And that leads me to my other point. Even though they used Chakotay amazingly on this planet, they totally misused Neelix. Now, I know there's a lot of hate for Neelix out there. A lot of people hate Neelix. I don't hate Neelix. I just think that the writers misused him, because sometimes he can be used right if the writers know what they're doing. Like in Jatrell is a very good example of the writers using Neelix correctly. And unfortunately, I think there are more episodes where the writers use him incorrectly, and this is a prime example of that. He's an idiot in this episode. He should actually be another one of the leaders like Chakotay, who knew, because he's used to surviving on minimal things. He even says that in this episode, but the way he acts demonstrates otherwise, because he's an idiot. He gets Hogan killed, and then he just totally freaks out and starts yelling at the primitive people and getting them all pissing them off and getting them to get even rowdy. So Neelix does suck in this episode, at least part 2, and so it was total misuse of him. Anyway, so my rating for Basics out of 10 is a 7, very good. I do think, even though I had some issues, especially with part 2, the way they were retconning things, especially killing off Seska and the whole Chakotay's son thing, I do think these episodes were interesting. There were a lot of strong parts in these episodes, especially part 1, which was really suspenseful and intense, even though it was kind of frustrating because you knew that your heroes were going to lose. And there were some good parts in part 2 with the way Chakotay handled the people, the natives on the planet, and the way that Suder's story arc, the way he sacrificed himself and by doing the thing that he didn't want to do, which is kill people, and that was very powerful. That's what really saves part 2 and makes them decent episodes, but still both episodes had a lot of issues. So yeah, so it was very good, but not great. So that's it for my review of Basics. So now it is time for me to choose which episode I'm going to review next. So, to select the options for our next poll that you can vote on for which episode you'd like me to review next, let's start with the original series option, which is going to be the Cobra Knight maneuver. Well, this was an option before, but it can be an option again because I never said that. I haven't reviewed it yet. So here's your original series option. The episode where Enterprise is forced to destroy a dangerous marker buoy and a gigantic alien ship arrives to capture and condemn them as crew, as the trespassers. Anyway, let's go to our next generation option, which is where no one has gone before. Seen by most as one of the better episodes of the first season, which was not very good. This is where we're introduced to the Traveler, because they do these experiments on the Enterprise that flings it into the other side of two other galaxies away. I think this is actually kind of the premise for Voyager, where they took their inspiration from. Decent episode. Anyway, let's move to the Deep Space Nine option, which is profit motive. Grand Nagus Zek is acting bizarre by giving away money and rewarding and rewriting the rules of acquisition. Quark attempts to get the old Nagus back. Actually, this is one of my favorite, one of my better liked Ferengi episodes, because I'm not a huge fan of these Ferengi episodes. But this one I actually thought was pretty funny. Rom, it's time for the Ferengi to move beyond greed. What do you mean beyond greed? There's nothing beyond greed. Anyway, let's go for a Voyager option, which is Shattered, which I already reviewed. You can check that out on my channel if you want to see my review of Shattered. So we'll move to another option, which is Heroes and Demons. After Harry Kim disappears during his Beowulf holo novel, Chakotay and Tuvok are sent to investigate, and they disappear, not wanting to lose any more crew members. The Doctor is transferred to the holodeck to investigate. This is a very early, this is season 1. This is a very early Doctor episode, because the Doctor wasn't used very much in season 1. Season 7 more than made up for that, but anyway, that's beside the point. This is a very, they would do episodes like this better later on. But this is a very interesting look at how they treated the Doctor in the first season. Anyway, let us now do the Enterprise option, which we do the old-fashioned way. Season 3, Episode 2. Okay, and I'll go to IMDb to see what that correlates to. Season 3... Episode 2 is Anomaly. Oh, this is actually a decent episode. This is actually a pretty good Enterprise episode where while they're exploring the Expanse, the Enterprise is attacked by some pirates. And Archer has to do some things he doesn't want to do in order to defeat these pirates. Very good episode. Very like that. Anyway, those are your 5 options. You can vote in the poll that you can find in the link below to the straw poll. Follow that link and it will take you to the poll. And I will review this episode in about 3 weeks is when I'll do my next review. So make sure to keep an eye out on my channel for that, as well as I do other reviews on other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.